Realm presents Born to the Blade, Episode 6.
Chapter 1. Chris. Chris could have used bladecraft. The servants and guards who rushed into their path at the Kuloi embassy would have gone flying with just a few shifts of Chris's sword, clearing the path to Ojo's door. But those people didn't deserve to be hurled about simply because they didn't understand that this was an emergency, that Chris could not wait. They had to see Ojo now. So they kept their blades sheathed and used their body instead. Eeling past secretaries, hip-checking one determined guard out of the way. Someone grabbed Chris's arm and regretted it a moment later because learning bladecraft didn't preclude learning how to break holds, too. And then they were at the door to Ojo's office, which opened before Chris could touch it, and the familiar bulk of Kulo's senior warder filled the opening. Ojo raised one hand. The growing clamor behind Chris died down.
"Please, go back to your work,"
Ojo said to the crowd.
"I will speak with Warder Den privately."
Chris heard the whispers as the embassy staff dispersed. That charge through the corridors wouldn't do Rumika's image any good, Chris knew, but... "Is it true?" they asked as Ojo ushered them into the office and shut the door behind them both. "Do you have news about the fleet?" They weren't alone in the office. A stocky, middle-aged woman in the round-collared silk robe and close-fitting cap of a Tsukiseni ship captain stood up, glancing first at Chris, then at Ojo, as if asking for permission. The Kuloi warder nodded heavily.
"Warder Den needs to know. Tell them what you told me."
Chris's shoulders tensed. News, yes, but not good news. Ojo wouldn't look like that if it were good news. The fleet was already long overdue. The Tsukiseni woman spoke crisply, with none of the languid affectation of that island's aristocrats. "I am Kamatsu no Chikafuru of the Tanagawa Maru. My ship recently passed near the Enguhin rocks, and we saw a large scattering of flotsam. The broken pieces of airstone hulls." The meaning of her words circled like a monarch waiting to strike home. "You mean, but that could have been from any ship. There was too much for a single ship. And when we examined the pieces, they clearly came from different vessels, judging by the construction of the planking." Ojo said quietly,
"She reported it to me because the flotsam was in Kuloi sky space, but one of the fragments bore a piece of the ship's name. Lee Mutable."
The eternally mutable. One of the 7 Rumikan ships sent to bear the shipment of airstone to Kulo. Chris sank blindly into a chair. They barely listened as Ojo thanked the captain and dismissed her, saying he'd be in touch if he had further questions. Chris ought to have interrupted then, asked their own questions, but they couldn't think of a single one. With the two of them alone in the office, Ojo simply waited, giving Chris time. But no amount of time would be enough. "How?" they whispered numbly. "How can the ships be gone?"
"We don't know yet,"
Ojo said. "They can't just have broken up for no reason." Chris's pulse accelerated as they considered the possibilities. Was there a storm, or monarchs? No, monarchs could never take out a fleet that large. A mist fiend? Kulo was sinking. Could it possibly have sunk far enough to be vulnerable to the predators of the lowest reaches? The smack of Ojo's palm against his desk stopped the rising flood of Chris's words. Their own voice sounded like a stranger's to them, tension forcing it high and shrill.
"Chris."
By contrast, Ojo's tone was soft and gentle.
"Calm down. Right now, all we know is that something has gone wrong. Speculating without evidence gets us nowhere. There may have been another ship that passed through before the Tanagawa Maru, or one near enough to have some idea of what might have happened. Rest assured that I'll share with you everything I learn."
This was supposed to be a victory. Rumika's grand entry to the world stage. An alliance with mighty Kulo and Chris's own blade sealing the deal. How could the other warder be so serene in the face of such a disaster? "But the fleet is gone. Ojo, the whole fleet. If any of the ships had survived, we would know by now. What am I supposed to tell Rumika?" Ojo's calm facade cracked.
"That is your concern, Warder Den, not mine. I have to explain this to Kulo. If you would like to conduct your own investigation, by all means, be my guest. I want to know what happened as badly as you do."
Storms, monarchs, mist fiends. Or something else. Chris whispered, "Treachery." Chapter 2. Ojo. Ojo closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. For the first time in his life, he found himself wishing he had a different birthright. The ability to douse for airstone created more problems than it solved, leading all of Kulo into disaster by encouraging them to find and exploit every last vein until the island itself began to sink. If he were Ikarin, though, he could at least have controlled his own mind. Shut out the distractions and worries, cleared his thoughts in the blink of an eye. Ojo, being Kuloi, had to sit at the edge of the ritual pool for several long minutes before he felt ready to carve the sigil of communion. His concentration faltered again as the image rippled and solidified. Instead of Chikozi, he saw 4 guildmasters in wraps of sober pattern and color, 2 men and 2 women. All were familiar to him. None of them boded well.
"Warder Kante," the older of the women said, "what news do you have for us?"
Guildmaster Nenge,
Ojo said. She was one of the most senior members of the Bright Chamber and one of the most uncompromising. Not a blade crafter, but if duels of will alone existed, Ojo would have gladly sent her to face down Levinia.
Where is Chikozi?
"The Bright Chamber held a vote,"
Guildmaster Isabri said.
"The 4 of us have been appointed to handle all matters relating to the current crisis."
Ojo's heartbeat thudded in his ears. He knew what those innocuous-sounding words really meant. There had been a shift of power in the chamber. These 4, Nenge, Isabri, Amawetsi, and Adokwo, led the High Skies faction, which had long advocated for Kulo to take more drastic steps to solve the issue of the sinking. They were the exact people he had hoped to defang with the Rumikan trade deal. And now they were controlling Kulo's government.
Nenge said, "I ask again, what news do you have?"
He gathered his thoughts.
My inquiries so far have only established a few things for certain. The ship sank near the rocks of Engwahin. Since we've restricted access to our own sky space, there weren't many other ships anywhere in the vicinity, and none observed what happened. They can confirm, however, that there were no storms. The favorable winds at the time were high enough that the fleet was unlikely to be sailing close to the mists, making a mist fiend attack unlikely. And monarchs, of course, would generally avoid so large a...
"Warder Kante," Isabri said, interrupting him. "We are not interested in what it could not have been. What might account for the fleet's disappearance?"
Ojo's jaw tightened.
Foul play,
he admitted.
At present, it seems to be the only possibility. I heard about the sinking from a Sukaseni captain. I'm looking into the possibility that she was involved and informed me in order to throw off suspicion. I don't think it's likely, though. The Hiroki are also suspects. We know their captains are more willing than most to sail low, which means they could have entered and exited the region without being noticed.
"Pirates," Nenge said, her lip curling in disdain. "They are scavengers, happy to pick off weak targets, but they would never be bold enough to attack such a fleet. No, this must be the work of a larger power."
I am also looking into Murtika,
Ojo said grimly.
They would very much like to see our alliance with Rumika destroyed.
Isabri laughed. "Alliance? A trade deal is not an alliance, Warder Kante. Especially not when a large portion of our end took the form of support for their candidate. Rumika already has what they wanted. Perhaps they saw an opportunity to profit from that airstone twice."
If communion had required concentration to maintain rather than lasting until it was banished, Ojo would have lost it in that moment.
You think Rumika is behind this? That's absurd.
"We have to consider the possibility," Isabri said.
Ridiculous. I know Chris, Warder, Den. They are far too honest to ever support such a thing.
Nenge brushed this off with a sweep of one ringed hand.
"Warder Den is not their entire country. If I were the Rumikans, I would have sent someone exactly like them, young, naive, trusting, and easily trusted. All the better to hide the real plan."
They'd be stabbing themselves in the foot if they did,
Ojo snapped.
It does them no good to have a warder in the circle if that person is seen as an ineffective patsy.
But even as he argued, even as the 4 guildmasters raised their suspicions and he did his best to strike them down, Ojo knew he wasn't even fighting a losing battle. This wasn't a battle at all. No matter how much logic he brought to bear, no matter how much evidence he could muster in support of Rumika's innocence, the guildmasters wouldn't listen, because that wasn't the point of this conversation. They were the leaders of the High Skies party. They had wanted decisive action from the start. And now, thanks to the fleet's disappearance, they would get it. Chapter 3. Bologna. The lowest island of Toifé stank. Although the middle island hovered well above, the close-packed buildings strangled the wind when it tried to blow through. The air between them filled with smoke and the sense of the 1,000 cargoes that entered Toifé, from produce to lamp oil, from lumber to pigs. And the people themselves. Bologna breathed shallowly through her mouth. Had sailors never heard of bathing? Make way! Make way! A cart was rumbling down the street toward her, piled high with imported bricks. Bologna had to press herself right up against the wall of a tavern to avoid being crushed. When she pulled away, her tunic stuck briefly to the wall before coming free. She sniffed out of reflexive curiosity and made a face. Ale. Her incarnation 2 lives ago had loved the stuff, but fortunately that predilection hadn't stayed with her. Ale was for the lower classes, not a warder. Her errand wasn't suitable for a warder either. Bologna wanted to tell herself that Levinia had given her this task because she couldn't entrust it to any mere servant. But self-deception was weakness. The senior warder's temper had been shorter than usual ever since that Rumikan upstart had joined the circle. No, ever since that colossal disappointment Oda no Michiko had let them in. Not that Kensuke would have fared any better. The valor and prowess of Kakute had dribbled away to nothing since the days of the Golden Lord. And so Levinia took out her annoyance on everyone, Bologna included. Or was there more to it than that? Bologna paused on a street corner, letting the crowds flow past her, while one hand slid inside her tunic to touch the envelope there. A simple courier's job. Go to the lowest island, find a man, give him a message. A sealed message. Levinia was up to something. That was screamingly obvious. A personal something, or the business of the Empire? She hadn't said. Bologna hadn't asked. But there were ways to break seals, weren't there, without it being visible afterward? She could find a quiet corner, meditate, see if she could recall using such tricks in a previous life. Bologna's lip curled. Such tricks. What was she, some decadent Tsukaseni aristocrat spying on her superior's mail? No, she wouldn't stoop to measures like that. She would find out what was going on, but on more worthy terms. She found her quarry in a gambling hall, the sort of place where people played simple games of chance, the role of skill limited to one's ability to palm cards or loaded dice. Marcos Harjo wasn't gambling, though. He was in a corner booth with a half-eaten bread bowl leaking remnants of soup onto the table in front of him, and a laughing young man draped across his lap. He didn't even glance up when Bologna approached.
Unless you're here to bring me another picture, I'm not interested.
Bologna's posture stiffened to military rigidity. I'm not a servant.
Then I'm not interested.
He reached for his mug, but Bologna snatched it away before his hand could touch the clay. Ale, of course. Ooh, the young man said, in the tone of someone expecting an entertaining fight. As if Bologna would bother fighting Harjo. The man was plainly Tuan, wearing the inelegant mix of styles that characterized natives of the tiered islands. In this case, a jerkin that would have looked vaguely Rumikan if it weren't for the Ikarin-style frogged closures over breeches tight enough to make a Hiroki wince. He was a mercenary, plain and simple, and being Tuan, he didn't even have a birthright to call his own. Bologna snapped her fingers to draw the attention of the young man in Harjo's lap. Go fetch your master a pitcher. He and I have business. When the young man made as if to protest, she fixed him with her best approximation of Lavinia's glare. Harjo sighed.
Go. I'll deal with this.
The young man slunk off, grumbling, leaving Bologna and Harjo in the closest thing to privacy she was likely to get. She said, I have a message for you from the top island. Ah. He continued to slouch casually in the booth, but she had his attention. And she suspected his recognition.
Give it here, then.
She didn't reach for the envelope. What is your business with my superior? One eyebrow rose.
Oh, if you don't already know, then it's none of yours.
I need to make certain you're the man I'm looking for. As far back as she could summon the memories, lying was an excellence she had never possessed. He snorted.
No, you don't. You came right toward me, straight as an arrow, and you didn't even ask my name before you said you had a message. You know very well that I'm Captain Archer. Now, give me what you have and be on your way before you attract any more attention.
The only way to improve was with practice. Bologna smiled thinly. Well done, Captain. I can see why she trusts you. She slid the envelope across the table. His eye roll said her second attempt wasn't much better.
I wish I could say the same.
The words lodged under her skin like barbs, chafing at her the entire way back up to the top island. I wish I could say the same. She wasn't a child, and yet Levinia treated her like one, alternately exhorting her to try harder, do better, achieve more, and stepping on her the moment Bologna tried to achieve anything more than what she was offered. Levinia wanted a puppet, not a junior warder. Sometimes Bologna wondered if Levinia saw any difference between her and the colonials. The embassy guards opened the front door for her, and Bologna swept through. She'd had enough. She detoured to her room for a change of clothing. A plain tunic that stank of ale and smoke would not help her dignity, but then went straight to Lavinia's office. The senior warder didn't even look up from the paper she was reading.
Did you deliver the message?
It was the last straw. Levinia was working rather than taking her ease, but otherwise it was exactly like Captain Harjo, dismissing Bologna as too insignificant to even merit eye contact.
I did, and it was a waste of my time.
That got Lavinia's attention. She slapped the paper onto her desk, staring directly at Bologna.
What?
Carrying a message to a ship, Captain, is not the duty of a warder. My time would have been better spent assisting you, but you wasted it. Lavinia's mouth settled into a line Bologna recognized all too well. Supercilious amusement. You were assisting me by carrying that message. Nor was that message the only example of your wastefulness. I am a resource, but you are not using me to my full potential. I know you are up to something, Levinia. If it is for the good of Michiko, then I would be far more effective if I knew what was going on. If it is not... Bologna stopped talking, but too late. Levinia rose behind her desk like a mist fiend breaching the clouds below. If it is not, what then? Do you accuse me of treason? No, Levinia. Bologna fought not to lower her gaze. I did not mean to imply any such thing. Only to say that I am eager to do whatever I can for the Empire, and I know I can do more than carry messages. So you question my judgment. You call my acumen into doubt. You seem to think that you could do better if you were the senior warder. Countries send blade crafters to serve as junior warders on Toifei, not only so that they can gain experience to use elsewhere, but so they can be of assistance to their seniors. I am your second blade, and you're leaving me in the sheath. Lavinia's hand shot to her sword hilt, fast as a striking viper. An inch of steel gleamed above the collar of the sheath, reflecting the sunset light. In a low, deadly voice, Levinia said, Kulo fight with two blades. A Mertican needs only one. If you have such reservations about how I conduct this embassy, then perhaps you would care to prove yourself in a duel. All the breath in Bologna's chest withered away. Duel Levinia? Absurd. It shouldn't come to this, one warder fighting another just because she wasn't being permitted to help. But if Levinia wouldn't see reason, then Bologna would lose. Excellence is not overconfidence. She'd said that once in a previous life. She couldn't remember which one. Bologna had a healthy respect for her own skill at bladecraft, but she had no illusions that she could defeat Levinia. And as much as she wanted to back her point with steel, losing would only prove Levinia right. Then Bologna would be honor-bound to knuckle under and accept whatever pathetic menial duties Levinia assigned to her, of which there would be many, she was sure. Bending her neck felt like bending the blade of her sword. It moved, but not easily. I apologize, Warder Junius. I have no intention of pushing matters so far. Lavinia's sword retreated into its sheath. Good, Bologna. It's one thing to strive for the highest you can reach, but you should know the limits of that reach. Now, leave me. I have work to do. Bologna left, closing the door softly behind her. Her face was blank, serene, as she walked down the hallway past various members of the embassy staff. Even when the door to her own room shut and she was alone, her expression didn't change. There is no such thing as the limits of my reach. Only an idiot concluded that because the peach was high in the tree, she would never be able to pluck it. Someone, sometime in the distant past, had faced the same problem and invented the ladder. Dueling Levinia was a losing proposition, but Bologna wasn't about to give up. She just had to figure out a better way to win. Chapter 4. Chris. When Alex opened the door, Chris almost snapped that they weren't accepting any more visitors today. Ever since they'd become the Rubicon Warder, they'd had a stream of people passing through, almost more than the guest quarters could hold, since Alex was still in the process of negotiating for a building to service their embassy. It had been exciting at first. Then the fleet disaster happened, and everything changed. People still came by, but not to talk about future business. They only wanted to fish for rumors about the fleet. Alex held up a hand before they could say anything. Warder Oda is here to see you. They couldn't turn away another warder, not even if Chris technically outranked her, senior to junior. Bracing their fists against the desk, Chris said, "Show her in." They expected her to look smug, but Michiko entered warily as if she guessed at Chris's mood and stood silently just inside the door. "Did you come to say I told you so?" Chris asked. "I've had half a dozen people in here telling me Kulo betrayed us." Their body tensed, remembering, and half a dozen more hinting that they think Rumika is responsible for the fleet's destruction. "Rumika?" Michiko said, startled. "But the airstone was on your ships, wasn't it?" Chris turned to pace, found their chair in the way, and shoved it aside with so much force it almost tipped over. "Exactly, but they seem to think that's proof. It was our ships with our captains. Maybe we staged a fake wreck so we could sell the cargo elsewhere. After all," they added bitterly, "we have what we wanted, don't we? A warder in the circle. Kulo can't take that back." "Do you think Kulo betrayed you?" Her soft question brought Chris up short. "She's not accusing us, at least." I don't know. I don't think Ojo would, but Ojo isn't all of Kulo." "And you don't think it's your own people, so who else could it be?" Chris eyed her sidelong. Michiko wasn't just good at reading people, she also knew how to hide her own thoughts. And Chris wasn't nearly as good at seeing through such facades. "There's one obvious possibility. But if you thought it was Murtika, you wouldn't be here talking to me. Unless Levinia sent you, maybe, as a feint." "Levinia didn't send me." Her swift reply carried an edge. "I'm asking because I genuinely want to know, Chris. One way or another, this means trouble, and I don't like not knowing which direction it will come from. Could Hiroki pirates have gone after the fleet?" "Oh, maybe," Chris said. "There's that guy, Anton, the one who hangs around Cassia. Maybe there's more to him than I thought, or..." Their pulse sped up. Vanians hate Rumicans. Now we've got a warder in the circle. I mean, what if this is revenge for that?" "Penelope spoke in your favor," she reminded them. Chris scowled. "Only because I won. And besides, if Ojo isn't all of Kulo, she isn't all of Vania either." "True," Michiko murmured, her gaze drifting as she thought. She stood silent for a moment, then said, "I'll look into it." Those 4 words shouldn't have made Chris's knees go weak, but they did. "Thank you. I never expected things to go wrong so fast. Having your help..." They swallowed. "It means a lot to me." Michiko's expression was still unreadable. "There is nothing to thank me for yet." Chapter 5. Ojo. Oda no Michiko wasn't the last person Ojo expected to see in his office, but she was near the bottom of the list.
"Warder Oda," he said formally. "Forgive me for being curt, but I'm afraid I'm quite busy. What is it that you need?"
She bowed with equal formality. "I will not disturb you at a time like this without good reason. I am looking into the destruction of the fleet, and I have come to ask you who you think might be responsible."
"Besides Murtika?"
The words leaped out before he could stop them, but Michiko didn't so much as blink. "Including Murtika." if that is where your suspicions lie. They certainly stood to benefit from disrupting the alliance between Kulot and Rumika, but why would they send Michiko to talk to him if that were the case? Or, for that matter, even if it weren't. Levinia didn't play these sorts of games, pretending to help just to gain advantage. She was too straightforwardly vicious for that. And Kensuke was too obedient to his imperial masters, too apathetic to pursue something like this on his own. Which left Michiko herself. Ojo studied her, not bothering to hide his curiosity. She'd been quiet since losing to Chris in the gauntlet. Chris was an excellent blade crafter, no shame in a loss like that, not any real surprise. But Ojo hadn't forgotten that Michiko had been Chris's final opponent. All Rumika's hopes had rested on her defeat, and Murtika's hopes had rested on her victory. What if she wasn't quite the model subject she appeared to be? What if she resented the ignominious death of the Golden Lord far more than she let on? What if... He couldn't spare any attention right now for the possibility of dissent within the colonial ranks. All his concern had to be for Kulot and this rift with Rumika, the plans of the High Skies faction, and how these matters would fall out within the circle. But if Michiko's loyalty was in fact cracking, then accepting her assistance would be a good move. And if this was actually a Murtican ploy, better to keep an eye on it anyway. Ojo said,
Virtually every nation might be a suspect. Kulot itself has been accused, as if we would have any need to steal or destroy something that was on its way to us regardless.
He kept his tone insulted and disbelieving, hiding the worm of suspicion curled around his heart.
We wouldn't steal it for profit, but the High Skies faction, they want something else.
Michiko nodded. And Rumika has likewise been accused on the theory that they wish to avoid paying for your support in the gauntlet, and stole back the airstone before sinking the ships to cover for it. Murtika would benefit from conflict between your two nations. Hiroki pirates are always a possibility. Suki-sen... Her litany faltered. I confess it seems difficult to suspect Suki-sen of anything. Ojo managed an approximation of a smile.
A suspicious mind would say that makes them the ideal suspects, but it would run counter to their history of isolation. Speaking of a suspicious mind, one of the Empress's colonies might stage such an action, in the hope of directing the blame at Murtika itself.
Michiko inhaled sharply. You accuse Kakute?
Or Mikado.
Ojo spread his hands in placation. Her instinctive recoil suggested she wasn't aiming to frame the Empire with this investigation, but it didn't rule out the possibility that others had staged the attack for that reason. After all, someone had gotten the Golden Lord out of prison and across the sky to Tuafe. He said,
I accuse no one, at least not yet. You asked me who might be responsible. The truth is, almost anyone could be.
What about Vanya? He'd been trying not to think about that.
I don't think the Vanyan matriarchs would condone such a thing. Battle mistresses are, if anything, honorable to a fault.
Not every battle mistress lives up to the ideal.
Not everyone is Penelope.
She would never do anything like this, a sneak attack to set everyone at each other's throats. Ojo wished profoundly that she were still on Tuafe, and was just as profoundly glad that she wasn't.
There are other Vanians besides the battle mistresses, he admitted reluctantly. Every nation has its zealots. Penelope told me there's a faction of Vanians whose feelings toward Rumika go beyond mere ideological disagreement. The Apolitoi. They have no official support, not these days, but that doesn't mean they couldn't have done something. I can ask around.
Shouldn't stayed far away from those people, but the tea house wasn't Ojo's only source of information. Yokno might be willing to help. You're up to your neck in this situation, Michiko pointed out. And you've been on Tuafe for years. People know your face. You'll attract far too much attention. Tell me where to go, and I'll look into it for you. Her offer seemed genuine, and it wasn't like he could prevent her from making her own inquiries. But he still had to ask.
Why? Murtika and Kulot aren't friends, and if you're not acting on Lavinia's orders, she'll be furious when she finds out. Why would you offer to help?
Michiko laughed quietly, as if at a private joke. It's what my ancestors would want. Chapter 6. Michiko. She hadn't lied to Ojo. Her ancestors did want her to investigate. In fact, it was the only thing they'd agreed on since the Golden Lord joined their ranks. Of course, they wanted it for completely different reasons. All of her ancestors knew Michiko would be among the main suspects, and with good cause. The Loyalists wanted her to clear the Empire's name. The Golden Lord was hoping she would prove its guilt. Michiko didn't know what she hoped for, or what she would do if she discovered the truth. She just hated the uncertainty, the feeling that someone had pulled a trick on the entire sky and was laughing as they all blindly lashed out at one another. And she hated watching Ojo and Chris hurt by it, when neither of them deserved to be in the center of this storm. She wasn't some sneak agent from Kakute's glory days, to skulk around in shadows or disguise herself as a Hiroki Bravo, but she had the sense not to wear a warder's finery down to the lower island. With her hair braided up under a kerchief and her clothing a motley assortment of pieces from various nations, she didn't obviously look like Kakute's junior warder, and if what Ojo said was true, she'd fit right in where she was going. The noise was audible before she even reached the doorway, rising up from the depths of a warehouse's cellar. Voices shouting an encouragement to frustration, and then the brassy clash of a gong, after which the roar subsided to only half of deafening. She'd found the right place. 2 women stood on either side of the door, one in a short Vanian gown and shin wraps, the other dressed much like Michiko. According to Yokno, this club had been started by Vanians, not battle mistresses, but their junior officers, looking for a place to hone their skills during shore leave. These days it attracted a wider clientele, but if she was looking for a place to find Vanians, he said it was a good place to start. She hadn't said outright that she was looking for hardline anti-Rumican zealots, but she had a feeling he'd guessed it anyway. As Ojo had predicted, Tuan neutrality didn't prevent him from answering a question, so long as it was plausibly innocent. The Vanian door guard nodded at Michiko's blade.
You planning to fight?
Possibly, Michiko said, doing her best to blur her Kakutan accent into something less easily placed.
Entry fee is a single, a triple if you want to fight. And no, you can't pay a single now and the rest later. You make up your mind now.
I might as well give myself the option. She dug 5 singles out of her pocket and handed them over. Yokno had given her plenty of useful advice, including the fact that waving around the higher denomination coins known as triples, for their emblem, the tiered islands of Toifei, would attract too much attention. What was she doing here, in a place where even something as simple as paying for entry with the wrong coins could get her into trouble? But retreating now would attract attention, too. The other guard pressed an inked seal to the backs of both of her hands, then waved her down the stairs. The cacophony below was almost tangible. On a raised stage in the center of the room, 2 women faced off, one Murtikan, one Hiroki. The latter kept flourishing her sword in ways that looked impressive, but the Murtikan just waited patiently for her opening. It came before Michiko even made it to the bottom of the stairs, a swift slap of blades, sending the Hirokis flying wide, and then a thrust to the shoulder, followed by a contemptuous kick. The gong sounded as the Hiroki crashed to the floor. The Murtikan accepted her winnings and left the stage, followed shortly by her defeated opponent. A Tuan girl, no more than 10, scurried out with a long knife and executed a sigil Michiko had never seen before. In response, the Hiroki's blood rose from the floor and sank into a large cotton towel that obviously had already seen use that night. With the stage cleaned, the Ring Mistress called out for the next 2 combatants to come up. The Ring Mistress was the reason Michiko had decided to come here. Yokno had told her that Phaedra Kuris permitted men to enter the club, excluding them would cut too much into her profits, but not to enter the ring. That wasn't enough to definitively mark her as apolitoi, but it meant those who were might drift toward her club. It had seemed like a good plan at the time, but now that she'd arrived, Michiko was much less certain. Even if there were apolitoi here, she could hardly expect them to stand around gloating about how they destroyed the Rumican fleet. And even if they did, she didn't stand much chance of overhearing them in this clamor. A thick ring of people surrounded the stage, watching and betting on the fights. More clustered around small tables, enjoying what food and drink the place had to offer. But they had to lean in close and shout to be heard even by their own companions. The only way Michiko could hope to eavesdrop was if she sat under the tables themselves, and they would certainly notice her there. She drifted clockwise around the room, trying to look like her attention was on the stage. Maybe if she bought something to eat, then asked to share space at one of the tables? But unless she knew which group to approach, that would be nothing more than a shot in the dark. There might not even be a group to approach. She was searching a haystack, with no certainty it even contained a needle. Someone stepped into her path. Michiko pulled up short, looking for another way through the crowd. Then she realized the man blocking her progress wasn't a stranger, though she'd never seen him like this before. Takeshi hadn't disguised himself the way she had, with mismatched clothing and a kerchief over his hair. He'd just made himself nondescript. His neatly trimmed beard looked mildly scraggly, his high-collared shirt and straight trousers a little shabby, not to the point where anyone would wonder how he could afford the entrance fee to the club, but enough that nobody would take notice of him. It was the body language, Michiko realized. Takeshi might not be the greatest bladecrafter in the circle, but like the rest of the warders, he moved like a swordsman. Not here, though. He slouched, he shuffled. He behaved as if he'd never been in a fight in his life.
"What are you doing here?"
He asked the question before she could, leaning in so she could hear him.
"I could ask the same thing of you,"
she called back, pitching her voice just over the noise.
"You go to Vanian dueling clubs for fun?" "I like to watch," he said. "Here, follow me."
Takeshi led her to the corner farthest from the bar, where it was marginally quieter than the rest of the room.
"It's interesting to study them," he said, once he could speak without straining his voice. "I don't get many opportunities to observe certain birthrights in action."
Her shoulders stiffened.
"Aren't the duels just to first blood?"
"Not all of them, especially not when both combatants are Vanians."
He jerked his chin toward the stage, where two women were testing each other's defenses. Michiko whistled silently. The Vanian birthright was sheer physical toughness, stamina, pain tolerance, and a resistance to infection that meant they often survived injuries that would cripple or kill anyone else. If the Ring Mistress here allowed duels to go past first blood, this was the best place outside of warfare itself for Takeshi to study the effect. So why did she get the feeling he wasn't telling the whole truth?
"You haven't answered my question,"
Takeshi said. No, she hadn't. Michiko weighed her options swiftly.
"The fleet," she admitted. "I think a certain country might be behind it. Or at least people from that country. And this might be a good place to find out."
Unfortunately, Takeshi was too smart to take that answer at face value.
"Yes, but how do you know that? It's obvious you've never been down here before. Someone told you about this place." "Levinia?"
He shook his head before he was even done saying her name.
"No, Yokno."
"What makes you think that?"
He grinned. "Because he's the one who told me a year ago."
"But why didn't he—"
Takeshi caught himself.
"No, that makes sense. I'm not sure why you're getting involved, though."
What had he not said? This conversation was shaping up to be more whole than cloth. Michiko herself could hardly tell the whole truth, not with the Golden Lord hoping for Murtican guilt. But she could say a few things, at least, while leaving her ancestors out of it.
"Because the two key parties are currently pointing fingers at each other, but it won't be long before they start pointing them at our side. I'm hoping to give them reason to look in another direction."
There, that should be both plausible and innocuous. Takeshi nodded, drifting off into thought. Between his unassuming manner and the way Bologna and Levinia treated him, it was easy to forget that he was the senior Ikaran warder, had been for more than a year, and without a junior to support him. He might prefer airstone theory to duels or politics, but that didn't mean he was useless at the latter. He said, "How exactly were you planning to accomplish that?" Here, she had nothing but the truth to offer.
"I don't know."
He didn't mock her for it. Instead, he said,
"Behind me, over my right shoulder. See the three women leaning against the wall?"
Michiko nodded.
"The tallest one is Dion Galanis. She's the kind of person you're looking for. But if you want to talk to her, you're going to need to prove you're worth her time."
In a place like this, his meaning was obvious, which was not the same thing as sensible.
"You want me to challenge some random Vanian officer to a duel of blade in an underground club?"
A faint grin touched his mouth. Takeshi shrugged and leaned against the wall as if settling in for some entertainment.
"You're the one who decided to fly into the mists. I'm just telling you which way to sail."
Chapter 7. Takeshi. Takeshi couldn't hear Michiko's conversation with Galanis, but he watched the body language of the two women, and Galanis' companions. Devonians went from bored to annoyed to interested. So, Michiko had the sense not to start by insulting Galanis. It would have gotten her a duel, but not an entry point into Apollitoi's circles. After a moment, Galanis belted up her gown to a more practical length for fighting and led Michiko over to Phaedra Kuris, the Ring Mistress. Kuris entered them into her book, and Takeshi settled in to wait. It wouldn't take long. Kuris had a habit of prioritizing Bonians, especially Apollitoi, who wanted to fight.
Are you going to place a bet?
He recognized the voice without turning around.
I never bet, Joshi. You know that.
She leaned against the wall next to his seat, arms folded. Her gaze was on the stage, not him.
Yeah, but this seems to be an unusual night. Friend of yours?
It wasn't a real question, not when she asked in that tone of voice. But Takeshi was never sure just how much Joshi knew and how much she was pretending to know in order to lure someone else into spilling more than they should. He said, "If you want to bet, be my guest. I'd put my money on the newcomer." Galanis was good, but not in Michiko's league. Joshi merely shrugged.
I came by to see how you're doing. You haven't been at the clinic much lately.
Training with Chris had eaten into Takeshi's spare time. He still couldn't believe he'd told them the truth, that he didn't have a birthright. Even Joshi didn't know, though he sometimes wondered if she suspected. They'd been friends since Takeshi first arrived on Toifei, as the junior warder to Fuwa no Ye. Joshi was a native of the tiered city, and the reason Takeshi had gotten involved with the clinic on the lower island, lending his medical knowledge to the work they did for Toifei's poor. There was no reproach in her tone, but Takeshi still felt guilty. I'm sorry, things have been... Well, there was the gauntlet, and now we're all adjusting to having a 7th warder, and then this business with the trade fleet. You heard about that? This time he was sure her nod wasn't a pretense.
Is that why your friend is down here, delivering a very tidy thrashing to a Vanian officer?
Takeshi's attention had wandered badly. Michiko and Galanis had taken the stage, and true to Joshi's description, Michiko had the upper hand. She could have won by now, he suspected, but she was holding back so as not to humiliate Galanis, who clearly had more to drink than she should have. The Vanian birthright didn't do anything to mitigate the effects of alcohol. When Galanis bore down, Michiko evaded and counterattacked only once, a cut to the knee that was easily parried. If she'd pressed, she could have put Galanis back on her heels, off balance, an easy prey. Takeshi might not be very good at focusing on his own battles, but he was perfectly able to analyze other people's. He shrugged in response to Joshi's question. That's her business, not mine. Would you like me to introduce you?
Nah, that's all right.
Joshi's gaze was distant, calculating as she watched the fight.
But I'll make you a wager. No money, just a prediction. This'll turn out to be a Kuloi scheme in the end.
You're only saying that because you don't like Kulo. The look she turned on him was cold as steel.
A country that once sank an entire island wouldn't hesitate to destroy a few ships. Don't forget that, Takeshi. Because I guarantee you they haven't.
The gong clashed. Michiko had won. Takeshi stood, applauding, and by the time the combatants had left the stage, Joshi was gone. Chapter 8. Michiko. Well fought, Dion Galanis said after they settled into a booth. Seating might be hard to come by in the club, but the booth's occupants had vacated without hesitation when Galanis arrived. She snagged the bottle they had left behind and poured Michiko a cup of something that looked like water and smelled like alcoholic licorice.
Though I wouldn't expect anything else from the junior Kakutan warder.
You know me, Michiko said, hoping Galanis couldn't tell her heart had just given a painful thump. Whether she had or not, Galanis snorted.
Did you really think you wouldn't be recognized? When you're the reason Rumika has a seat in the circle now.
Damn it. Michiko hadn't even thought of that and should have. She let her fury at herself color her voice to make her next words more convincing. Not by choice. It was my duty to stop them, and the fact that I failed keeps me awake at night.
Poor babe,
Galanis said dryly and knocked back a healthy swig from her cup. Michiko might have earned a modicum of respect from the woman for her performance in the ring, but that wasn't enough. With a silent apology to Chris, she said, Why do you think I came here tonight? That got Galanis' attention, finally. The Vanian woman rolled her cup between her fingers, studying Michiko.
We're not used to getting approached by Murtikans.
We? Michiko held on to that word, letting it distract her from the complicated sting of being called Murtikan. It was the first Galanis had let slip that she represented more than just herself.
My senior warder wouldn't exactly be welcome among you, she pointed out. Warder Junius might be, but that would require her to admit anything of value can be found beyond Murtika's borders.
This time Galanis' snort was more amused. Which Vanya isn't. Not yet, anyway.
I'm not either of those people, Michiko said. I'm neither apathetic nor blind to the world around me. And I know there's more to Toifé than just what happens on the top island. With connections down here...
She picked up her own cup, raising it to Galanis and toast.
There are ways and ways of interfering with someone's efforts in the circle.
The drink burned like licorice someone had lit on fire. Galanis waited until Michiko had choked it down, then said,
Bold words from a junior warder who hasn't even been on Toifé for a year.
Michiko resisted the urge to wipe her streaming eyes. Galanis might not be a battle mistress, but she was clearly the kind of woman who despised weakness.
More effective I make myself here, she said. The sooner Warder Junius and the people back home will notice they could be represented so much better in the circle.
To her surprise, the words weren't even a lie. She could do better than Kensuke, because she could bother to do anything at all. Even if she failed, that would be more than he'd accomplished. Galanis considered that for a long moment. Then she lifted her cup, returning the toast.
To ambition, then, and the prospect of new allies.
Chapter 9. Cassia. On a subconscious level, Cassia almost didn't expect the sigil to work. She'd practiced it hundreds of times before with her own blade. She'd watched Penelope carve it with the ritual sword of the Vanian warder. But this was the first time she'd done it for real, with that sword in her hands, inscribing a quartered ring and its 4 inner marks over the water of the communion pool in the warder's circle. The surface rippled, changed, settled. And she saw Vania. The communion chamber there, anyway. Cassia hadn't seen Vania itself in years, and unlike Penelope, she didn't miss it. Toifé was much more congenial, with people from 100 major and minor islands passing through. She returned the ritual sword to its sheath and saluted. The water reflected the images of the Trine, the 3 most senior and powerful battle mistresses who ruled Vania. They returned her salute, and Iona Nisu, the eldest of them, spoke.
Warder Protem, Petros. We hope you have a full report prepared on this matter of the missing fleet.
I do, Cassia said, taking a sheaf of paper from a leather folder. Penelope had never required notes, but Penelope had years of experience under her belt. Cassia didn't want to rely on memory and forget something, humiliating herself in her first communion with the Trine. The 3 women listened in attentive silence, only breaking in with clarifying questions twice. When Cassia finished, the other 2 looked at Nisu, who nodded crisply.
Thank you, Warder Protem. That was succinct and well-ordered. Is there anything else you feel it is necessary to add before you receive your orders?
The word orders felt like a chain settling over her shoulders, but Cassia didn't let herself sag beneath the weight.
No, Sifos Nisu, that is everything. Very good. Then your instructions for the time being are to refrain from any action that might be construed as showing support for either Kulo or Rumika in this conflict.
As if the matriarchs would ever give orders to publicly support Rumika. Cassia saluted again.
I understand. Until we know which of them is responsible, we can't risk allying ourselves with either one.
Nisu frowned.
Do not leap to conclusions, Warder Protem. It may be that neither of them is responsible. We are currently investigating the possibility that zealots among our own people may be behind this.
She flushed in embarrassment.
I should have known better than to speak up.
Zealots? The Apolytoi? Anton had run into a crowd of them once, and as usual, his smart mouth had gotten him into trouble. But it was a long lunge from harassing one man to attacking an entire fleet.
I will be circumspect,
she promised. As orders went, these were the best she could have hoped for. Unless this turned out to be the work of Vanians, after all, she prayed it wasn't. Then it wasn't really Vanian business. Penelope would have gotten involved for Ojo's sake, but Penelope was gone.
See that you are, Nisu said, commanding her gaze.
Cassia quailed under the old woman's regard. Did she somehow know about Anton, or was that just a general admonition, a reminder that Cassia represented her nation now? Either way, there was only one response.
Yes, Sifos,
she said, and saluted one final time before drawing her blade and ending the communion. Chapter 10. Anton. In the peaceful light of afternoon, it was hard to imagine that anything had ever gone wrong here. The Englehin rocks floated off the port bow of the Blue Knife, rugged and mostly lifeless. Here and there, pockets of earth allowed grasses and flowers to cling, but mostly they were bare rock, with traces of airstone veins gleaming through. Given the rumors about Culo, Anton was surprised the Englehin cluster hadn't already been mined, the dead rock allowed to fall into the mists far below. He was closer to Culo than caution would recommend. The Kuloi had gotten more and more defensive of their territory as their home island faltered, allowing very few foreign ships in, and most of those Sukaseni. The suspicious-minded said that was because they didn't want anyone to see how far they'd sunk. The differently suspicious-minded said it was because the tales of sinking were greatly exaggerated, played up for sympathy and to keep anyone from seeing Culo as a threat. Anton felt a brief stir of curiosity at that thought. I bet I could sneak in. But that wasn't why he'd come here. This long after the destruction of the fleet, there wasn't much left to see. A few bits of wreckage had drifted and been caught in the rocks, but the rest had long since dropped from the sky, taken by the mists. The rocks themselves, however, were still there. Anton lifted a spyglass to his eye, surveying the cluster.
That one. 3 points to starboard, he told his helm. Take us in close.
The Blue Knife eased its way in among the rocks, his bladecraft navigator practically dancing with her greatsword to keep the wind from driving them into a collision with the islets. It was a close fit, even for a ship and crew as nimble as Anton's, but it could be done. Swarms of pinnies sheltered within the archipelago, detectable to the human eye only as an opalescent sheen in the air, rippling like curtains as they darted away from the ship. The afternoon's light grew richer as the sun descended, and the Blue Knife continued to explore.
You could do it,
his first mate Aline said at last, dragging the kerchief from her hair and retying it more securely.
But it would be tough.
Anton nodded. There was room to hide an attack fleet behind the Englehin rocks and send them swooping out at the trade flotilla in a pincher move.
Holding station while you waited for them to pass through would be the hardest part.
Aline shook her head.
Not if you're clever. Use the airstone and the islets to bracket yourself. They're close enough. Balance of forces.
He was a better bladecrafter than his first mate when it came to combat, but she knew navigational sigils better than he did. If she thought it could be done, then it could. Now the question became, who had the ability to pull it off? The ships, the navigators, the captains necessary to make a move like this work?
Captain!
The shout came down from the crow's nest.
I see something. That long, flat rock, dead astern.
Anton's skin jumped. An attack?
What do you mean, something?
A pause from above. Then the lookout said,
It looks like a person.
Maneuvering the Blue Knife through a 180-degree pivot without cracking against anything would have been impossible. Anton ordered the ship to lift out of the rocks, then tacked through an arc that brought them down toward the islet in question. As they drifted overhead, he took his own spyglass to the rail and searched. Wreckage dotted the rock, driven there by the winds or the blasts of bladecraft that had taken out the trade fleet. And a few pieces of it, Anton realized, had been assembled into a crude shelter.
Aline, he said, the command is yours.
Before she could object, he flung himself from the ship. The Hiroki birthright flickered briefly, trying to keep him aboard, but gave up in recognition of his choice. Anton scribbled a sigil as he fell and hit the islet like a spring, his legs coiling and then lofting him into the air once more. In 3 bounds, he'd crossed to the shelter, and there he stopped, blade out. There was someone inside, their feet just visible at the edge of the shelter, but they didn't move. Anton decided he'd been cautious enough. Sheathing his sword, he called out,
Hey, are you alive?
No answer. He came closer and nudged one of the feet, resigned to finding a corpse. and heard a faint groan from within, like it came from someone who had spent weeks clinging to life on this rock and was about to lose their grip. Anton stared. Then he backed up, scribed Voice of the Storm, and shouted up to the blue knife, "I found a survivor!" Chapter 11. A Sky. Few captains would be bold enough to fly with all sails spread on a moonless night. Although they had no need to fear running aground, as river barges did, the sky held its own hazards. Monarchs regularly hunted in the dark, feeding off the water-rich pinnies clustered together for warmth, and the mists always rose higher with the cooling air, bringing a greater threat of fiends. Nor were monsters of the sky the only reason to exercise caution. Dirt huggers thought of the sky as being vast swaths of empty air, with relatively few islands scattered throughout it. Sailors knew better. There were countless minor islands, most of them too small to support habitation, and even smaller masses that amounted to little more than floating boulders. In the skies around Culo, the mining guild had captured almost all of these and stripped them of their airstone. But elsewhere, they still abounded. Colliding with one could damage a ship. The biggest risk, though, was navigational. Those boulders and minor islands were vital to the calculation of altitude. In the dark of a moonless night, with visibility cut short, it was all too easy to veer off course. A captain who flew too fast might miss their target entirely. This captain was one of the best her country had to offer. She did not miss. Silent as a mist fiend, her ship moved into position. Narrow-bodied, sharp-prowed, built for speed. Blades gleamed up and down her deck as the initial wave readied themselves. On a hissed cue, they moved in unison. The sigil for airstone stance, which would let them survive the drop to the ground far below. Then the bladecrafters charged the rail of their ship and leaped into the air. They struck before dawn, and at first it was a silent fight. Most of the attackers broke into the low, sprawling building that dominated the small island's only settlement. They didn't bother kindling lights to guide their search. Instead, they dumped every document they could find into sacks for later sorting. The remaining 3 broke off and headed for the nearby houses. But the silence didn't last. The facility had guards, and the houses had a man who, suffering from insomnia, had decided to go for a quiet walk. Both sounded the alarm before the attackers could take them down. It was bloody, but brief. Soon everyone was awake, the defenses mustering. The invaders beat a hasty retreat, leaving with only half of what they'd come for. Papers, but no prisoner. Chapter 12. Chris. The ritual sword was a heavy weight in Chris's hands. They remembered the first time they'd used it, communing with Rumika after their victory in the gauntlet, announcing the plans for the deal with Culo. It wasn't that long ago, but already the happy memory had faded like a painting exposed too much to the sun. Everything had gone so bad, so fast. People accusing Rumika, people accusing Culo. Chris even found themselves looking at Ojo with suspicion, when not that long ago he'd seemed like their best ally in the world. Adechike kept trying to smooth things over, but the fleet had been destroyed and its cargo had vanished, either stolen or lost to the skies. How could anyone mend that? Chris took a deep breath, resting the point of the blade on the stone at the edge of the pool. The sword was dull. It didn't need an edge to make the sigil work. And there was no one there to see Chris using it as a crutch, leaning on it while they tried to gather their wits for the upcoming conversation. People back home would want to know what progress Chris had made, whether there was any news on the fleet, and what could Chris tell them? A Mertican colonial was investigating. That would hardly reassure anybody. Delaying wouldn't make it any better. Chris settled their hand on the ritual sword's hilt, raised it in a salute, and carved the sigil of communion. As soon as the face of Vic John rippled into view, they knew something was wrong. Formality splintered into fear. What happened? Vic looked haggard, as if they hadn't slept all night.
Culo attacked the facility on Orsa.
What? Chris grounded the sword's point, supporting knees suddenly gone weak.
It was a raid. They broke into the processing plant and stole documents. Looks like they took everything they could get their hands on. And they tried to take Lee, too. If she'd been in her house, they'd have her. Thank the gods she has a lover. She was at Eloin's house that night instead of her own.
Orsa, one of the airstone processing facilities. The secret to Rumika's sudden rise, not a particularly pure vein, but a way of purifying normal ore, increasing its effectiveness so they could do more with less. Kulo had attacked. How had they known?
I was going to ask you that,
Vic said grimly. Chris hadn't even realized they'd spoken the thought out loud.
Have you left any files lying around where others might see? Have there been any Rumikan captains in port who might have let something slip? Have you said anything?
Sickness sank into Chris's gut.
I don't know. Maybe? I can't be sure. You've got to find out. If the Kuloi know where the other facilities are, they might attack those too. Files, Lee, it's clear they want to steal the secrets of the process from us. They might keep trying. And even if they don't,
the damage was already done. Kulo had attacked an outlying Rumikan island. This wasn't just about a missing fleet any longer. It was war.
You're listening to Born to the Blade, Episode 6, by Marie Brennan, starring Exie Sands. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm, listen away. Born to the Blade is created by Michael R. Underwood and written by Michael R. Underwood, Marie Brennan, Cassandra Kaw, and Malka Older. It is executive produced by Julian Yap and Molly Barton. Audio production, sound design, editing, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith.